Everyone, welcome back to another episode of AskGN. Sorry, I'm not doing the intro with Snowflake for this one. We're flying to Taiwan and we need to get this done immediately. This is the series where we take viewer questions and try to answer them to the best of our abilities. You can leave your questions in the comment section below, but I have a specific request for the types of questions for this one. We'll talk about that in a second. And as a separate note, if you do want to see your dose of Snowflake, the cat for this week, you can check out our CubePet Yeston case review for that. So this is episode, I think, 112. We've got some really good ones here. Like, for example, what does AMD need to do to compete effectively or continue to compete effectively? And a couple of others about, well, just general topics. But AMD is a hot topic for this one. We had Intel as a hot topic for the last one, so figured we'd balance it out a bit. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's conductonaut liquid metal. Conductonaut is what we've used in all of our liquid metal and delid thermal tests, capable of dropping CPU thermals significantly when replacing the stock thermal interface. Lower CPU thermals don't just allow better overclocks, but also lower noise levels because the transfer efficiency is increased. The mix of gallium and indium makes for a thermal conductivity of 73 watts per meter Kelvin, outclassing traditional pastes significantly. Learn more at the link in the description below. All right, so before starting this one, the types of questions we'd like to see from you. We have a lot of opportunities to talk to some extremely knowledgeable people in the industry while we're in Taiwan for the next couple of weeks. We're going to publish this right around when our trip starts, and what we'd like from you is a few different things. We want to film a special AskGN episode in Taiwan, and I'm not sure the exact format yet, depends on the questions, but one option would be Ask an Overclocker. We're going to be speaking with Kingpin from EVGA. He's basically one of the world's top overclockers. His name is on the Kingpin PCBs. So you've got a lot of really good opportunities to ask really good questions of him that I can't answer. So think about it. Think pretty hard about what you want to know, and leave your questions below. Please, if you don't have a question, just do me a favor, read them and upvote the best ones, because that'll help us filter when we're traveling. And then separately, we were also talking with High Cookie, so he's another overclocker. We might get a chance to talk to some others, but definitely Kingpin and High Cookie, extremely good overclockers, very knowledgeable. If you have more advanced questions about the overclocking process, please leave them below. We'll pass them on. Another opportunity for you all, this is very much a viewer engagement segment, so we'd like to put them out and the options in front of you. Another opportunity is we're going to be visiting a lot of markets and market vendors. If you have questions about just computer hardware, prices, availability, used market stuff, as it pertains to Taiwan or Asia in general, if you're maybe in the US and you're just wondering about how, if it's different there, how things work, whatever, leave those questions below as well, and then we can gather information about that stuff. And lots of, like I said, anything you can think of relating to speaking with experts in the industry at the source of manufacturing, which would be mostly Taiwan and China for manufacturing sources. This is a good opportunity to ask those questions, so leave them below and we'll do a special AskGN in Taiwan. Might get some of those people on camera, but in the very least I can ask them off camera and then present the answers. One last note too, we are going to have, so we've got the Patreon page, patreon.com/gamersnexus has a bonus AskGN episode on it. That's only available to Patreon backers. It's just an extra thanks for supporting us. It helps us fund things like our trip, which looks like, now that I've run the numbers, is going to cost us around 20 grand or so, maybe a bit under, but somewhere in that range. So you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, get the bonus AskGN there. And then finally, on the GN Steve secondary channel, we're going to have a bonus public bonus episode just to address the questions about the bike frames on my wall in the previous one. Okay, enough of all the intro for that. We've had timestamps up, so you could have skipped if you wanted, I guess. But let's talk about the first one. YouTube comment from Der8auer from the last one said, "Ha ha ha, that GTR burn and old video usage. Not bad, Steve, not bad." Well, I'd just like to point out that Roman for once said not bad, as opposed to what he normally says, which is not even bad. And one time I said to Roman, not even bad kind of implies that you expect it to be bad, but that it's not even that. And he said, I know. He's a mysterious man. All right, next one. This is the big one for us. So I've inserted this question on my own, but I think it's an interesting one, if I do say so myself. The reason we inserted this, which is what does AMD need to do to continue to compete effectively, is because in the last AskGN episode we did, or one of the last two, people asked about what does Intel need to do to come back, and we really talked about that for a long time. So I want to look at the opposite of AMD's kind of here now, so it's not what do they need to do to compete, but what do they need to do to keep competing and not lose their grasp that they've reattained. So let's talk about that. AMD has obviously extremely good engineering foundations at this point. They're very stable with Zen. They're in a good spot. They've lost some engineers to other companies over the past couple of years. So some of the original Zen 1 architects or engineers have moved on to other companies. This is a normal part of the process. And a lot of these people, I mean, it's a really narrow field in terms of your experts who are available. And so it's common for them to kind of move around between companies as projects start and end, especially for the people who are more focused on the challenge of it than anything else. And so that'll affect things, but in the very least, AMD's in a good enough spot now, and they have enough cash flow now, which wasn't always the case, that it can find the right people, hopefully, to continue things on the engineering front. So engineering's in a good spot. The biggest potential for a blunder at this point would be in marketing. AMD, at this point, it's not about not as much about gaining recognition or gaining respect or gaining trust, which was a big one, where people with, I mean, Zen 1 launch and all the motherboards and all the issues they had with those, for a long time after that, even once the issues started getting resolved, you'd see comments of, well, I'd recommend Ryzen for my friend, but they're not technical, and Intel's more stable, or Intel's more reliable, or Intel's not going to have BIOS issues or whatever. So AMD's worked really hard to try and gain some trust there. And that's the most difficult thing it had to do, was get community trust that, yes, the performance is good, but is this platform going to screw me over somehow in a way I don't know? Kind of like what was happening with the Navi cards for a while, and might still be. We haven't looked into the newest drivers. But so the biggest way they can stab themselves in the back at this point is marketing, because the engineering's good. AMD needs to dial back its marketing claims in some ways, in our opinion. It got railed over PBO and AutoOC for claiming numbers like 4.75 gigahertz, which were effectively impossible to achieve with the means that were presented and marketed. AMD, in the past, has gotten a lot of underdog allowances, like an underdog card it could pull over the past years. But as it begins and continues to surpass Intel in the spotlight, that underdog card's not always going to work. It won't always be there. People aren't going to be as willing to overlook mismarketed numbers as AMD takes the spotlight. This is for a few reasons, but one of them is that you're giving people fewer things to look at and focus on. And when people can focus on, in general, in the news or the reviews world, what you kind of learn as on our side of things is that the community really only has the capacity as a mob, as a unit, collectively, to sort of narrow in on a couple of points. And while individuals might be able to look at the greater picture, as a community, as a mob mentality, really only a couple things at a time can exist at once, and then it'll sort of subside and some new item will come in and take its place. And with AMD, when it was getting back into this, it's always just, the story was primarily focused first and foremost on, look at this actually really competitive part, good price, doesn't overclock as well, but who cares? It's good, pretty good out of the box. That was the story. And although there were things that were mismarketed, and they were covered too, like we did talk about, for example, PBO, we did a whole big thing on it. It wasn't the primary part of coverage, especially not ours. We were so focused on the positive side of the story, which is the parts are good, that the negative side of the story, although it got coverage and it got a lot of views, it doesn't get anywhere near the amount of traction, no matter how much we care, as the positive side does. And that's because it's overwhelmingly positive. But as AMD begins to, or continues to roll forward, and it benefits from being in a position where people aren't as easily excited about its gains anymore, or its launches anymore, because perhaps at some point the novelty wears off, or at least the we need competition wears off, and it's like, okay, this is just how it is now. They're just better. If that, the benefit of being able to beat down the competition wears off, and suddenly AMD's only competing against itself, which was sort of true for Zen 3, but it still had enough excitement behind it, then AMD is going to be in a spot where people will begin looking for things to pick apart. And those things would be marketing. And it means that there's less of a positive story, or less of this new exciting competitive angle of things to bring up and surface in conversation and comment sections and wherever. And there's more space or more airtime for people to talk about what might have gone poorly or been mismarketed or whatever. So we think that AMD, at this point, it's in a good spot, but it needs to be really careful about its marketing. It needs to focus on, to quote a contact of ours in the industry, it needs to focus on just winning, just win. And you don't need to win by a lot. You don't need to lie to win. Just get there. Just stay ahead. So that's what AMD needs to do. Focus on the hardware, make sure the hardware is good, tell the story about the hardware as it is factually accurate and easily proven. And you know, if there's something that you think is true but you're not quite sure, or maybe tech marketing didn't really understand what engineering was saying, they mismarketed it, just stop. Just let it rest, don't push it forward. And if it turns out that this feature you thought was going to be amazing but you guys weren't sure about, speaking to AMD, then let the press or the community discover it and let that be the positive story, rather than the inverse, which is market something that might end up not being true, and then you have a huge negative story. So that's what we think AMD needs to do to continue to compete effectively, is be careful of its marketing. That's the biggest way AMD has stabbed itself in the back in the past. Its hardware is good, so keep pushing with the hardware. Now, another thing on the market side of things, AMD has told us that it needs to get into the hands of more OEMs or more system integrators. And they've done a really good job at that this year. They're still pretty, they're lacking representation overall in the sort of the pre-built market, especially as marketed to non-enthusiasts. People who don't know who we are, might not even know who Linus is, to give you an idea of who I'm talking about. So that's the audience AMD, that it has told us, by the way, this isn't my speculation, that AMD needs to go for next. They need to work with OEMs and kind of push past marketing development fund that Intel has allocated. By the way, AMD does that too, but Intel has a whole lot more money. And that's where they need to start pushing outside of the marketing, is focusing on more OEM spread. And they've done a good job of starting that, but there's still a lot to be desired in OEM availability. And that's really a lot of that. Same with retail education, you'd call it, education of Best Buy employees, for example, who don't, you go into a Best Buy store and ask about computers, and a lot of them still don't really know anything about AMD. That's not really necessarily the employee's fault, because it comes down to what have they been trained on. And AMD's training, it's not quite as good for retail as Intel's has been, and that's because, again, Intel has a lot of money. They can spend money on this. They can fly people out to seminars and host events and do on-site, hands-on training. And AMD will struggle to compete as well there because it's a money problem, but it's getting in a spot where it can start doing it. So at this point, it's not just engineering, it's not just marketing even. It's about maintaining goodwill, and it's about how the fastest way to lose goodwill is to misrepresent the product. So AMD really needs someone knowing people at the company. AMD really needs someone to sit between the engineers and marketing and technical marketing, and properly push back and say, wait a minute, marketing, is that true? Prove it. And that's where we think they need to be. Another point too I'll bring up is that we'd like to see, I don't know if this is an AMD needs to do this to compete, but it will certainly help. If AMD can continue to bring its older products down in price as they age like it's been doing, that's been Intel's weakest point over the years, is that it lets the old product stagnate at the same price, whereas AMD, in a more desperate position originally, and even still relatively, has needed to bring down its pricing. And the upside of that is, even though their margin goes down on older stuff like 1600, the sales volume goes up. And so people who don't have a lot of money and who are looking at an option of, I can buy a used Intel CPU or even a new one for insane markup, or I could basically build an AMD system at half the original cost, because the Zen 1 stuff is so cheap now. So AMD needs to keep sort of flooding the market at the low end with its older architectures that people aren't as excited about anymore, because they're still good and they're still competitive. And because of AMD's chiplet approach, it can afford to cut its margins and still make money on a cheap $85 1600AF. That's a great way to flood the low end and start building that trust that we talked about originally that those users don't have, because they've used Intel for a decade. And when they built a computer last, they knew that Intel had something good and AMD had FX, or AMD had blue screens, or whatever AMD had, or a class action lawsuit. So flooding the lower end market is a really good strategy on AMD's part. We'd like to see that continue, but who knows how that'll play out. As Intel starts to lose its position, and AMD might not need to do that anymore. Although to gain market share rather than just sales volume per month, AMD will need to do that, because Intel still has insane market share, even though AMD has insane sales volume per month right now to enthusiasts. All right, that's a really long question. Next one, that should just be its own video. Whatever. Next one, Jack Taylor. This one is from, I think, YouTube, and it says both Amazon and SCAN have the 3950X in stock and currently on discount. Yeah, so like half the comments last time were in response to the question of, was the 3950X, 3970X, 1090XE, was that a paper launch? And I said, yes, they were paper launches for the most part. Just as a reminder, the word launch means when it came out, not 5 months later. So all the people who are like, it's in stock now, you've got really selective memory when it comes to AMD, because when those products launched, and we've got sales data to prove it, where people were paying $1,000 for a 3950X because they were getting gouged because there was no stock. When it first launched, it was pretty limited in inventory. Yes, they're in stock now. The word launch, though, it doesn't mean every time stock arrives. It means the one time it comes out. Anyway, that one was super annoying to weed through. Rudy from YouTube says, do you foresee AMD continuing production on previous generation parts on the respective manufacturing process that has already gone down in price, and continue selling those at discounted prices, specifically Zen 2 after Zen 3 is released, much like what happens to Zen Plus, because the alternative is the old Intel route with no discounts at all on previous gens because production has stopped. This is sort of what I talked about. I'll briefly touch this one again, but it's already happening. The main reason AMD made the 1600AF to address the first part of the question is because it wanted to continue, for some reason that I don't know, the production of the R5 1600 in name. And the wafer supply for the R5 1600 was no longer available. AMD made everything it had that process for, and it ran out of the wafers. So in order to continue making that part, where most companies would discontinue it, AMD continued it for reasons that we don't fully know, but they're probably business related, as in business to business related. It instead pulled the R5 1600 forward to use Zen Plus architecture and made it effectively an R5 2600 for crazy good value, but with a different name than an R5 2600. In fact, an older name. We think it should have been called something like a 3550 or whatever. They could have gotten away with it, but that's fine too. So we'd speculate that this is maybe for some sort of contractual reason, maybe with some big OEM or SI, they needed an R5 1600. We're really not sure. Either way, though, the answer to the question of production is yes, they did continue it. It's just that it's sort of in a weird way in that they made it better for cheaper. So it's not really continued, but because it all works on the same platform, it basically is. There's not many deployments where it would actually matter that you can't buy the old 1600 anymore, which is objectively worse than the 1600AF, which is objectively better and cheaper. There's not many of those that I can think of, other than maybe like some IT world reasoning where you're like, your boss is like, no, we need the 1600 because all these machines have 1600s in them and we need to keep using that. I can't really think of another reason. So anyway, as for whether that'll keep going, it's hard to say. We'd imagine AMD would eventually fall into the potential for an Intel trap of stagnation, as you'd expect of a market leader if it gets there. It's got a ways to go. It's possible. Right now it's looking good for AMD, but Intel has stuff coming out too. But let's just say AMD gets to a market leadership position, by which we mean the majority of not just sales, but market share too, then there's a chance it could sort of stagnate. So it'll really depend on Intel at that point. How hard does Intel push AMD? Because AMD is going to be the one that needs competition to be motivated to keep pushing and spending as hard as it has been. Once it's at the top, if it doesn't need to spend as hard anymore and Intel's really far behind at some point, you might see a bit of stagnation, but this is obviously, that's just, I mean, just kind of talking general terms of how the market works, and it's not a real point, it's just speculation. Anyway though, AMD isn't out of the woods yet, still needs motivation to compete. The company isn't so big that it can just sit on old supply, and it has motivation today to move old units rather than let them sit permanently in the channel. And so you're going to see those price reductions. Intel's been able to ignore this in the past and just let old supply sit and decay at their last official pricing because they didn't care. Next one is from YouTube. This is from Stephen Gibson, who said, will GPU performance outscale performance demanded in games, I like this question, by so much that we eventually see XX50, XX60 series NVIDIA cards able to run AAA games at max specs? Or will we artificially increase performance demands of GPUs to play games via higher resolution displays? Well, that's always the thing, right? You're talking about maxing graphics. You sort of can do that these days at 1080p with cards that are, at least in name, if not in price, lower than their predecessors. But yeah, it's a good question. This is essentially an arms race, and we think that developers will, again, this is sort of informed opinions from us. It's called AskGN. So our opinion of this at the team is we think that developers will either scale their games to meet the capabilities of the new cards, which is typically what we've seen, thus perpetually keeping the pricing stack and hierarchy relatively undisturbed, or developers will begin to cut corners on optimization and let hardware do more brute forcing, because you could, I mean, you call it laziness if you want, but it's also just not spending as much money, which is good for them too. So either way, it doesn't seem like they'd continue heavy optimization practices while also allowing graphics quality to stay where it is today and stagnate. It probably wouldn't be good for the industry, frankly, if everything stagnated, the games industry, not even just hardware. We're talking games here. So they have plenty of motivation to keep pushing graphics either through gimmicks or through actual improvements. And one interesting third party to the table here is that of game engines. This is, I've got a book over there somewhere. I think it's called Game Engine Architecture or something like that, and it's really interesting. But game engines are really becoming more the center of things these days than they ever were. It's always been important, but as game engines have consolidated into really just a couple of key ones, like Unreal Engine, to some extent you still have Crytek, a lot of it's really Unreal Engine, and then the in-house engines for games that have annual releases. As they consolidate like that, we're seeing engine developers pick up the role of some of the optimization, where this is important because there are people who've spent decades only optimizing things like shader execution on hardware, and those people are mostly spread between a few companies. Nvidia, Unreal Engine, or Epic Games, I should say, and to a lesser extent, AMD and Crytek, with AMD probably being the third one in there. So, or what's left of Crytek anyway, too. So those people are there. It's a narrow skill set as well. It's an important one. And as engines are able to pick up a lot of that slack, game developers don't really have to do as much of it. So it'll just become a question of the arms race between pushing graphics and pushing hardware. And we would imagine that they would pretty much keep going because everyone's got a vested interest in you spending more money. That's how it works, right? So the video card companies want you to spend more money. They don't want you to sit on their same product for 5 years. Spoke to Logitech about this years and years ago, and one of their representatives, whom I won't name for obvious reasons in a second, said that they had problems with the Logitech G5 mouse being too good and not breaking enough, where their sales suffered because of it. So same thing with video cards. No one at these video card companies wants you to sit on their card from 5 years ago. And the game developers don't want you playing their last year's game because the graphics stagnated and you know the gameplay is not much different anyway. So everyone's got a vested interest in it, which is why I would answer your question with, yes, we will see performance demands increase on the GPU side to keep taxing them in a way that they do today. Catawalks, this is on YouTube. It says, will you ever bring back the GN Copper cups? I didn't convince myself I needed them until they weren't available anymore. Sorry. I'm not sure. I'd like to. I'd definitely like to. A few things with that. We've tied up a lot of our money for product development stuff and other stuff that's going on right now. Check our Don't Panic, or whatever I call it, video for more information on sort of how that side of things has been delayed by human malware. But between mod mats, new toolkit runs, new mouse pads we have coming out that are desk length and really awesome, and a couple of other things I can't mention yet. We are, I mean, I'm fully invested. I can't spend more on stuff. So I really like the copper mugs. I want to bring them back. Another thing is we need to find a new supplier because the one we were working with isn't making it anymore. Like they, we source a supply, we make demands of it, and then you just kind of hope that they keep making the thing. So we could potentially do it, but I need to find another supplier. I could easily do a stainless steel cup with a copper plating. That's trivial. But what we were doing was a full copper cup with a nickel plating on the inside, and that's difficult. So I don't know. Maybe I'll do a stainless steel one with copper plating and do something clever. But I've got some ideas. But I don't know. It wouldn't be like the same copper-centric approach, which was the coolest thing about it. Still be pretty cool though. I've got ideas. Unfunk on YouTube says, question for the next AskGN, why does L3 cache keep increasing, but L2 has been stuck at 512 per core since forever? This is a good question and one that I should reach out to some experts in the industry on, and we'll try to do when we're in Taiwan. But I'm going to keep this short. To the best of my understanding right now, today, without seeking out some expert insight on this, this is because the cost of L2 and both the SRAM cost and the physical space cost getting sitting close to the cores, and also because latency is a concern and point of consideration for that as well, where you've got, you start making sacrifices on latency. But I'm going to have to leave my answer kind of vaguely there. I apologize for not having more depth on that one, but we'll have to talk to some people about that. Next one, Discord, from the GN Patreon Discord. Grandis Bolus says, are the GN Toolkits permanently out of stock, or is the new batch coming? No, they're not permanently out of stock. We made a couple of cool changes to the mold, and I'm really excited about it, but I can't talk about it yet. I'll give you a brief bit of info, though. One of the things that I wanted to improve was that we had some single-use plastic bags on the tool handles to try to protect them during transit. So we made some changes to the packaging and of the tools, and then to the production of the handles, to the mold, to eliminate that plastic bag. So we're able to eliminate 10 single-use plastic bags, one for each tool per kit. Hopefully, it looks like it's going to work. So yeah, that's why that's been on such a hold, is because engineering a solution around, I don't want a bunch of disposable one-use plastic in the product. It feels kind of bad, and so we dropped something like $8,000 on molds and worked with the factory doing tooling and tests, and how do we make this thing so that it doesn't get damaged in transit, because that's the downside, right? We could have not used the bags to begin with, but then you end up with a bunch of products arriving and maybe you have a slightly higher defect rate, and now you have to throw the entire thing away instead of just the bag away. So it's never an easy solution, but anyway, that's why they were on delay while I was trying to figure out the solution to something that, I mean, frankly, we could have just kept selling it like that and no one would have really complained, but I didn't like it. So I felt it was wasteful. So we're trying to fix that. And yeah, I have actually, as of day of filming, within the next hour, I'm going to be seeing the new sample. And then it's just going to be a matter of working with the factory to finalize it. That'll take a couple months to get everything done and in. Let's see, next one. Vernacular. YouTube comment. Will GN ever do content about small form factor cases and components again? It may not be possible to standardize, but it's still very fun, interesting content. Goes on to say, it's nice to see that larger channels like LTT do something with SFF, albeit rarely, but GN gave up on it altogether. I somewhat understand why, but I'm disappointed. Well, okay, so first of all, our policy of things, I don't have more than 30 employees like Linus. And so what we do, I don't ever want to grow to that size either. So what we do is we focus on doing a few things really well. And if I can't do it really well, if I can't make some of the best content about that particular product category, then I don't do it. And I know that I fully understand why you would like to see that, and I agree that it would be nice to provide, but we're stretched so thin with what we do right now. And we've also, you have to remember, we have a video upload allowance. We're more than one video per day. It's not really sustainable because YouTube doesn't really reward you for it. You end up splitting your audience. So there's a lot of logistical challenges there where if we're kind of at the max already or very close to it, then something else has to go. And in this instance, we've just added cooler testing back in finally. I don't know if the videos are up yet when this goes up, but they're done. So we've got cooler testing in, we have cooler reviews back, And that took 6 months of refinement over 3 years of data that we had. We refined it for 6 months. And it's not easy. So if I can't do it and provide one of the best sources for that component, I don't. And sorry, but that's the way it is. Let's see. Let me take this one more. Last one. Joaquin Permuy says, I know you guys aren't planning to be as big as something like LMG, but ideally, how many employees would be ideal for you? Love the videos. Keep it up. Thank you. Really interesting question. I should probably do this in more depth on the secondary channel or something, but I'll do a bit here. I don't want to become a big empire in the way that Linus has done it. I really like what Linus has done. I respect it. I'm regularly in awe of their work at the studio, at how big it's become, and it's amazing. However, I don't want to be in his position, and I am glad that he's willing to do it because I don't want to. So this is not about a comment about Linus. It's a comment about what do I want to do. So that was the question. So even though I think what he's done is amazing, I would, I've spoken with Linus personally in a lot of detail, just off camera, about the process of, I think I asked him most recently when I visited him, I said, at what point does it get easier? I said to Linus, I was wrong. I thought that hiring people, all these years, I thought hiring people would make it easier. But I'm working more hours than ever. I'm working harder than ever. I have to work harder because now I've got people who need to get paid. And if I don't have work for them, they need to find it somewhere else. So, and you don't want to lose good talent just because you don't have enough work. So the challenge that I've run into over the last year especially is one of trying to figure out how do I produce more content, and Patrick has been involved in this deeply too. So really it's, at this point, it's how do we, Patrick and I, produce enough content to saturate the video production schedule so that everyone's got enough hours for the week. And that alone is such an enormous amount of stress, and just, it's constantly shuffling schedules and moving stuff around, cutting corners sometimes when you don't want to. It's hard. I don't want to scale that problem up. Right now, I figured it out. I've got a pretty good handle on it. As long as I can work the hours I'm doing, then we're good. At some point, I probably would want to bring on another content production side, someone who could do some of the writing, but not yet. So the question of how do you scale? The other thing that's kind of challenging for me too is I've always been a min-maxer with RTS is what I grew up on, strategy games. I was really competitive in them. I was top ranked in a couple of them for a while. And that follows through with my business approach, where it's weird because I could hire another person to help and take some of that workload, the content production workload, from me. But then there's two things. It's immediately you start thinking about, okay, I'm going to have an extra, let's say 8 hours free per week or whatever, because I won't have to do this thing. So what can I do with that 8 hours? Instead of I can stop, I can relax, it's what can I do instead? So it's kind of hard to willingly, take a cut out of your profit to reduce your own workload when you're used to working the hours that I've done. Anyway, to answer the question of how big, I think I'd probably go for, I like where we are now. I'd like some more consistent hours for the team on the video side. We're working towards that. Patrick and I have basically, in lieu of getting another person in, we've decided we're just going to automate the hell out of everything. So I'd like to even out the hours there, and then I'd like to add someone on the ad management and sales side. We have Ryan Greenberg. You've seen his name on some things in the past. He's done some of our market analysis stuff. He handles a lot of the ad reporting for me, actually all of it these days. So he interacts with the advertisers, he sends them reports and deals with that for me. But I'm still involved in some of that stuff, like negotiations and sales, and I'd like to stop. One, to have an editorial barrier, and two, because I don't want to do that. It's not interesting to me. I'd rather spend the time doing testing. And every time I get back to testing, in the testing room right there in the lab, it feels so good to work in that room, surrounded with all the white noise of computers and all the challenges and cool problems you have to solve. But I don't get to do it as much as I'd like because I'm stuck in the other room doing production, like writing and making sure I can manage the tasks so that I can get on camera in time to make sure Keegan can do this part of the video, and Josh can do that part of the video, and Andrew can do this part of the video. So what I'd like to do is add, I think, someone on, like, get Ryan doing more of the ad stuff for me, sitting as a barrier between me and the advertisers, and then maybe one person on content production. And I've got someone in mind, but we're not there yet. So 2. I think that's what I'm looking at. So what would that put us up to? 2, 3, 4, 5. That'd be about 7 people plus the contract side of things. So we've got Eric Hamilton, who is an excellent news writer. He does our news roundups. And yeah, so we'd be at 7, 8 plus contractor, basically. I don't want to scale beyond that. And rather than having to hire, Linus, his answer to my question, does it get easier, was yes, 10 employees. That's when it gets easier. I don't want to get there. So instead of doing that, what we're trying to do is Patrick and I work really hard at just automating the hell out of every single thing to the extent that people haven't really, to our knowledge, done before in the space. And we're just trying to replace the need for more people with that, because it's hard enough to manage the company as is, and I don't want to sacrifice quality. So if we keep it about this size plus, let's say max, not even minus, just plus, potentially 3, then that, I think I'm going to call it there if I can. Unless we start expanding into more channels, at which point maybe I'd hire out for that, like hosting, but that'd be different content. So my goal is to keep the content as it is today. I can feel some days my grasp slipping on my ability to hone the technical side of it. And so right now I have the ability to contact everyone and say, hey guys, sorry, let me push back 3 hours. Sorry to do it to you, but we just got to film later today so I can get it done properly. And I worry that if we hired too many, then it would go from that to being, well, screw it, we just got to film. And I don't want to be there. So I'm really happy with where we are now, but I could use maybe a couple more. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to the GN Steve side channel for a bonus public episode, or go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out there as well. I'll see you all next time.